Imagine walking into the happiest day of your child's life, only to be told you don't belong. My name is Robert Carter, and on the day my only son David got married, I wasn't welcomed with hugs or tears of joy. Instead, his bride Emily looked me in the eyes and said, "You're not invited. Please leave." In that instant, years of fatherhood, sleepless nights, scraped knees, graduation cheers, were erased. This isn't just a story about rejection at a wedding. It's about family, betrayal, and what it means when love becomes conditional. Before you judge me, before you decide who's right or wrong, walk with me through this journey. Because what happened that day didn't just change my relationship with my son, it changed the meaning of family itself. And maybe, just maybe, it will make you question your own. Stay with me, because the truth will break your heart. That morning I woke earlier than usual, long before the alarm on my phone buzzed against the nightstand. My body was restless, humming with the kind of nervous excitement only a parent can feel when they know their child is stepping into a new chapter of life. I lay there in bed staring at the ceiling, remembering the nights when David was just a boy, his tiny body curled into mine as thunderstorms rattled the windows. I thought about all the moments that had led to this one. The scraped knees I had patched with shaking hands, the science projects built on the kitchen table at 2 a.m, the silent car rides home after teenage arguments that seemed endless. Today was supposed to be the culmination of all of that. Today was supposed to be my reward. I took my time shaving, making sure not a single rough edge of stubble remained. I picked out my best suit, a navy blue one I had worn only a handful of times. David's high school graduation, then his college graduation, and now his wedding. I pressed the shirt the night before, crisp white, the kind that never seemed to fit quite right on my broad shoulders but still carried a sense of dignity. I slipped the jacket on and studied myself in the mirror. The man staring back wasn't young anymore. His hair was mostly gray, his skin a little looser than it once was, but there was still a spark in his eyes, the same spark that had carried him through years of hard work and sacrifice. On the dresser sat a small box wrapped in silver paper with a blue ribbon. Inside was the pocket watch that had belonged to my father, David's grandfather. It had been passed down through 3 generations already, and today it was meant to become his. I picked it up, turned it in my hands, and whispered, "He'll understand what this means." It wasn't just a gift. It was history, a symbol of everything I hoped to pass on. The church was only a 30-minute drive from my house, but I left early. I wanted time, maybe too much time. The roads were quiet, the radio playing songs I barely registered. My thoughts drifted to David as a boy, running down the street with his baseball glove too big for his hand, shouting, "Catch, Dad, catch!" I remembered his teenage years when he grew distant, when he'd roll his eyes at my advice, slam his bedroom door, and insist he knew better. Despite the distance, despite the friction, I had always believed we would come back together. I thought today would be the day it all made sense. As I pulled into the church parking lot, I noticed the line of cars already stacked neatly along the curb. Guests in pressed suits and flowing dresses walked toward the grand doors, laughter spilling into the autumn air. I felt a flicker of pride. My son had built a life that attracted people, that drew them together. I stepped out of my car, holding the watch box carefully in one hand, and adjusted my tie with the other. The closer I walked toward the entrance, the heavier my chest felt. Not from nerves exactly, but from anticipation. I imagined the look on David's face when he saw me, how he'd smile with that boyish grin, how he'd hug me tightly before heading to the altar. I rehearsed the words I wanted to say to him before the ceremony. "I'm proud of you, son. No matter what happens, remember you're never alone." But I didn't get the chance to say any of that. Just as I reached the top of the steps, the doors swung open, and Emily appeared. She was stunning, dressed in her gown already, though she hadn't yet walked down the aisle. The lace of her veil shimmered in the morning light, and her hair was perfectly curled, a frame of gold against her pale skin. For a brief moment, I thought she had come to greet me, to welcome me into the moment that was about to unfold. But then I saw her eyes, cold, calculating, with no trace of warmth. "Robert," she said, her voice sharp but quiet enough not to draw attention. You can't come in. I froze, thinking I had misheard. What do you mean? I'm here for my son's wedding. Her expression didn't change. I know. But this isn't your place. We don't want you here. The words didn't land at first. They seemed impossible, absurd. My heart thudded, my throat tightened. We? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. David knows I'm here. He invited me. She shook her head slowly, her lips pressed tight. David doesn't want a scene today. He agrees this is for the best. You should leave before people notice. It was as if the ground tilted beneath me. I gripped the box tighter in my hand, my palms damp. For a moment I thought it must be some kind of cruel joke, that someone would laugh and say, "Got you!" But no one laughed. Behind Emily, the church doors remained open just enough for me to see the dim glow of candles inside, the rows of flowers, the guests settling into their pews. I could almost hear the soft hum of the organ warming up. The world was moving forward without me. Please, I said, the words spilling out of me more like a plea than a command. He's my son. This is his wedding. You can't. Emily cut me off with a raised hand. Robert, I'm not going to argue with you. This day is about us. And you've caused enough tension already. If you love David, if you care about his happiness, you'll leave. Quietly. The sting of her words burned deeper than I can describe. Caused enough tension? Was that really how she saw me? As a burden, an obstacle? I wanted to push past her, to storm into the church and demand to see my son. I wanted to shout his name, to hold up the watch, to remind him of every night I had spent working to give him this kind of future. But my feet wouldn't move. My throat closed around the words I couldn't form. Guests continued to walk around me, casting curious glances but not stopping. To them, I must have looked like just another late arrival, a man lingering too long at the doorway. None of them knew the war happening inside my chest. None of them knew that the father of the groom had just been told he wasn't welcome. Emily stepped closer, her perfume sharp in the cool air. She lowered her voice to a whisper, almost gentle, though her words carried daggers. Go home, Robert. It's better this way. For everyone. I stared at her, searching for even the smallest crack in her resolve, something human I could appeal to. But there was nothing. Just a wall I couldn't climb. For the first time in years I felt small. Smaller than I had when I buried my wife. Smaller than I had when I worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. Smaller than I had when David told me I didn't understand him anymore. This was different. This was erasure. I stepped back, 1 foot, then another. Emily's eyes followed me until I reached the edge of the stairs. My legs shook as though they belonged to someone else, my vision blurred at the edges. I wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. Not here. Not in front of her. I turned toward the parking lot, each step echoing in my ears. The laughter, the music, the life behind me carried on without pause. My son's wedding was happening, but I wasn't part of it. I was no longer part of him. When I reached my car, I opened the door slowly, as if any sudden movement might shatter the thin shell of control I was holding onto. I set the watch box gently on the passenger seat and sat behind the wheel, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. The man staring back looked hollow, like someone who had just been carved out from the inside. In that moment, I realized this wasn't just about a wedding. It was about something deeper, something broken long before I reached those church steps. And though I didn't know it yet, that day would mark the beginning of a journey I never expected to take, a journey through betrayal, loss, and the search for a meaning of family that went far beyond blood. The drive home that day felt endless, though I knew it was no more than half an hour. My hands clutched the wheel tightly, the watch box still sitting beside me like a silent passenger. I couldn't bring myself to open it. Every time I glanced at it, the weight of disappointment crushed me deeper. As the trees blurred past and the familiar streets of my neighborhood came into view, my mind drifted, not to the humiliation I'd just endured, but to the long road that had led me there. People often believe wounds appear in one moment, that betrayal or heartbreak strikes like lightning. But more often, it is years in the making. Threads woven too tight, or sometimes too loose, unraveling slowly until the final snap comes. That was true for me and David. And if you really want to understand why a father could be turned away from his own son's wedding, then you have to understand where it all began. I was born in Akron, Ohio, in the summer of 1969. My parents weren't wealthy people. My father, Thomas Carter, worked at the rubber factory, while my mother, Susan, kept the home and raised us with a kind of fierce devotion that could soften even the hardest days. They didn't have much, but what they did have, they poured into their children. I grew up believing in work, in showing up even when you didn't want to, in keeping your word because it was the only currency a man truly owned. That was the world I inherited, and it became the way I lived my life. When I met Linda in my early 20s, she was everything I wasn't. Bright, lively, filled with ideas about the world that went far beyond Akron. She studied literature, loved theater, and had a laugh that made strangers turn their heads just to hear it again. I was drawn to her like a moth to flame, and against all odds, she loved me back. We married young, moved into a small apartment with leaky pipes and squeaky floorboards, and dreamed of the family we would one day build. David was born when I was 27. I still remember holding him for the first time, the way his tiny fists flailed, the sound of his first cry. I wasn't prepared for how much it would change me. Fatherhood wasn't a job you clocked in and out of, it was a calling. From that first day, I promised him I would never let him feel alone in the world. But life has a way of testing promises. Linda fell ill when David was only 7. At first, we thought it was exhaustion, maybe stress. But after the tests, the doctor said the word I still hate hearing, cancer. It moved fast, too fast. I tried to shield David from the worst of it, but how do you shield a child from watching his mother fade away? We held her hand until the very last breath, and then it was just the two of us, father and son, adrift in a world that suddenly felt twice as large and twice as empty. I didn't grieve the way some men do, not openly. My grief came out in work. I took extra shifts at the plant, sometimes working 16-hour days. Bills piled up, and I refused to let David go without, not after everything he had already lost. So, I traded my nights and weekends for paychecks. I packed his lunches, made sure his homework was done, and taught myself how to braid his hair when he was little because Linda wasn't there to do it anymore. I played both roles, or tried to. And though I stumbled often, I thought he understood. But kids don't always see sacrifice as love. They see absence. They see the empty chair at the school recital, the father too tired to stay awake through a bedtime story. They hear, maybe tomorrow, more than they hear. Yes. I thought I was doing the right thing by working so hard, but in truth, I was building walls between us without realizing it. David grew older, and with each year, he pulled further away. In middle school, he started spending more time with friends than at home. By high school, our conversations were often short and clipped. "How was your day?" I'd ask. "Fine," he'd answer. "Did you eat?" "Yeah." "Anything you need?" "No." It was like trying to hold water in my hands. No matter how tightly I cupped them, it slipped through my fingers. I tried, Lord knows I tried. I drove him to baseball practice, even when I was dead on my feet from the night shift. I stood in the bleachers, clapping when he hit a ball, shouting encouragement even when my throat was raw. I worked on his car when it broke down, gave him what little advice I knew about dating, about college applications. But I always sensed that something in him resented me. Resented the way I pushed him, the way I expected him to work hard, the way I never let him quit. He was bright, far brighter than I had been at his age. He wanted to study engineering, said he dreamed of designing things that mattered. I supported that, though I didn't always know how to show it in words. My way of showing support was making sure the tuition checks cleared, making sure he had gas in his tank, making sure he didn't have to worry the way I had. But the more I gave in money and labor, the less I seemed able to give in presence and warmth. That was our fault line, and it deepened over the years. When David went off to college, I felt both pride and fear. Pride because my boy was making it, fear because I knew distance would stretch the thin rope we were already clinging to. We spoke less often. Sometimes weeks went by without a call. When he did come home for holidays, he seemed like a guest in his own house, polite but distant. I told myself it was just growing pains, that every parent feels this. But deep down, I knew something had shifted permanently. And then came Emily. The first time David mentioned her, it was casual, a throwaway detail in one of our brief phone calls. "I've been seeing someone," he said. I asked her name, and he said, "Emily Johnson." I could hear the way his voice softened when he spoke it, the way he lingered on the syllables. I knew then she was serious. When I met her a few months later, she was polite, courteous even, but there was a sharpness beneath her smile I couldn't ignore. She came from a different world, one of private schools and vacation homes, a family with money and influence. I was the opposite of everything she was accustomed to, and I felt it in the way she looked at me, as though measuring my worth and finding it lacking. Still, I tried. For David's sake, I told myself I would learn to accept her. But even in those early days, the tension was there. She questioned small things: why I didn't travel more, why I still lived in the same modest house, why I drove the same old truck. I could sense she thought I wasn't good enough, not refined enough, not the kind of father-in-law she wanted for the man she planned to marry. At the time, I brushed it aside. What mattered most was David's happiness, and if she made him happy, then that was enough. Or so I thought. Looking back now, I realized those cracks had always been there, waiting to split open. Emily's disdain, my pride, David caught between two worlds. It all led to that moment on the church steps when she told me to leave. But before you think this is only her fault, let me be clear: I wasn't blameless. I know my mistakes. I know I was too hard on David sometimes, too stubborn, too unwilling to say the words that mattered most. I never once told him, "I'm proud of you," without attaching a condition. "But work harder, but stay focused, but don't let it get to your head." My love came wrapped in rules, and while I thought it would prepare him for the world, maybe all it did was push him further from me. And yet, even knowing that, I can't escape the pain of that day. The day my son's bride looked me in the eye and denied me entrance to his wedding, to the moment I had waited for since the day he was born. That was when the past and present collided, when every sacrifice and every mistake came rushing back, reminding me that love, as unconditional as I thought it was, had been judged and found wanting. If I close my eyes, I can still picture David at 5 years old, running across our front yard barefoot, his laughter ringing through the summer air as he chased a plastic airplane we had launched together. He tripped, skinned his knee, and came running to me with tears in his eyes. I scooped him up, patched the scrape with a band-aid, and said, "That's part of life, son. You fall, you get back up." He sniffled, nodded, and then tore off running again, as though the pain didn't matter. That was David, resilient, determined, unwilling to let anything hold him down. Those moments were what made fatherhood feel like magic, like a gift I hadn't deserved but had somehow been entrusted with. As he grew older, those moments became fewer and fewer, but they never disappeared entirely. I remember sitting in the bleachers during his Little League games, shouting encouragement until my voice went hoarse. He wasn't the best player, but he worked hard, and when he hit his first home run, he looked straight to me, eyes shining, as though seeking my approval. I gave him a thumbs up that day, and the grin that spread across his face is something I'll carry with me forever. But as David moved into his teenage years, everything seemed to change. He grew quieter, moodier, the way many boys do. Our conversations dwindled to short exchanges, and sometimes silence filled the house like a third presence we both avoided acknowledging. I tried to bridge the gap. I offered to take him fishing, to go on drives like we used to teach him how to change the oil in his car. Sometimes he agreed, but other times he brushed me off, lost in the world of his friends, his music, or the glowing screen of his phone. I didn't blame him, it's what teenagers do, but I worried. I worried that the boy who once ran to me with scraped knees and wide eyes was slipping away, piece by piece. And in my worry, I did what I thought was right, I pushed harder. I pushed him to focus on his grades, to think about his future, to avoid mistakes I believed could derail his life. When he wanted to skip practice, I reminded him of commitment. When he wanted to drop a tough class, I told him he wasn't allowed to quit. When he came home past curfew, I grounded him. I thought I was shaping him into a man. But looking back, maybe I was also pushing him further from me. One night when he was 16, we had one of our worst arguments. He had come home late, nearly midnight, after telling me he'd be back by 10. I was sitting on the porch waiting, the house dark except for the light above the door. When he walked up the steps, I said, "Do you know what time it is?" He rolled his eyes, muttered, "I'm not a kid anymore." That stung. "You live under my roof, you follow my rules," I told him. "You don't get it, Dad," he snapped, his voice sharp. "You never get it. You just work and then come home and act like you know everything. You don't even know me anymore." Those words cut deep. I wanted to shout back, to remind him of every sacrifice I'd made, every hour I had worked so he could have a better life. But I didn't. I just stood there, silent, as he stomped inside and slammed his bedroom door. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering when exactly the distance between us had become so vast. Still, despite the conflicts, there were moments of closeness, brief flickers of the bond we once had. When he graduated high school, I sat in the audience, clapping until my hands hurt as he crossed the stage. He looked for me in the crowd, and when our eyes met, I felt that same pride I had the day he hit his first home run. Later, when we celebrated at a small diner, just the two of us, because that was all we could afford, he said, "Thanks for everything, Dad. I know I don't always show it, but I do." Those words carried me for years. College took him further away, not just in distance but in spirit. He called less, visited less. When he did come home, it felt like he was already halfway out the door. I told myself it was normal, that young men grow wings and fly, and it was my job to let him. But deep inside, I longed for the boy who had once run into my arms without hesitation. When he first brought Emily home, I wanted to believe she could help bridge the gap. She was charming in that polished way that comes from money and privilege. She spoke with confidence, carried herself with ease, and clearly adored David. But I also noticed the way she sized up our home, her eyes lingering on the worn carpet, the faded wallpaper, the sagging couch. I noticed the way she smiled politely at my stories but never asked a follow-up question. It was as though she was tolerating me rather than trying to know me. Over time, I saw her influence on David. He began dressing differently, speaking differently, carrying himself with a new air of confidence. That wasn't a bad thing, necessarily. People grow, they change. But sometimes it felt like he was shedding the parts of himself that tied him to me. The working-class roots, the simple values, the lessons I had tried to instill. Emily's family lived in a different world, and David was being pulled into it. One evening, after a holiday dinner where Emily's family had joined us, I overheard her talking to David in the kitchen. She didn't know I was nearby. "Your dad's sweet," she said, her tone kind but condescending. "But he's so rough around the edges. I just hope he doesn't embarrass us at the wedding." Those words burned into me. Embarrass them? I had spent decades keeping our lives afloat, sacrificing everything I had, and now I was nothing more than a liability, a potential source of shame. I didn't confront her about it. I didn't even confront David. Instead, I swallowed the words like bitter medicine and told myself I'd prove her wrong. The tension grew subtly after that. Little exclusions that most people might not notice. They planned events without telling me until the last minute. They laughed about jokes or memories I wasn't part of. When wedding plans began, I found myself left out of decisions I thought would naturally include me. Emily's father was heavily involved, writing checks and making arrangements, while I was rarely consulted. I told myself it was fine. Money speaks louder than pride, but deep down, I felt the cracks widening. Still, I clung to the hope that David and I could find our way back. Whenever he did call, I tried to keep the conversations light, asking about work, about his plans, about Emily. I tried not to sound judgmental, though I often worried my tone gave me away. I wanted to tell him I missed him, that I longed for the bond we once had, but the words never seemed to come. Pride has a way of silencing love. And so, by the time the wedding approached, our relationship was already fragile, though I refused to see it. I convinced myself that the wedding would be a new beginning. That standing by his side as he took his vows would heal the distance, would remind him of the father who had never stopped loving him. But of course, it didn't happen that way. Instead, Emily's voice at the church steps became the final nail in a coffin I hadn't realized we'd been building for years. When she told me to leave, when she said David didn't want me there, I heard not just her words but his silence. He hadn't fought for me. He hadn't intervened. And in that silence, every unresolved argument, every distance, every unspoken word between us came crashing down. I tell you all of this not to make you pity me, but so you understand. Fathers and sons don't break in a single moment. They erode slowly, like a cliff battered by waves, until one day the ground beneath your feet gives way and you fall. That wedding was my fall. And I've been climbing, grasping at jagged rocks, ever since. The first time I properly met Emily wasn't in some grand setting. It was in my own living room, on a warm spring evening when David had driven down from campus to introduce her. I had mowed the lawn that morning, scrubbed the kitchen until the counters gleamed, and even polished the old oak table that had been in the family since my parents' time. I wanted things to look right, wanted to show her the home that had raised the man she claimed to love. I remember the way David walked in, his arm hooked around hers, his face lit up with a joy I hadn't seen in years. "Dad," he said, "this is Emily." She extended her hand with a smile that was polite but faintly distant. Her grip was firm, her nails manicured, and her perfume carried a sharp floral note that filled the room as she stepped inside. "It's nice to finally meet you, Mr. Carter," she said. "Robert," I corrected gently. "Mr. Carter was my father." She nodded, still smiling, but there was a flicker in her eyes I couldn't place. Something calculated, maybe, or maybe I was just imagining it. I wanted to believe she was simply nervous, meeting the man who had raised her boyfriend. But there was a wall there, thin but unmistakable, between us from the very start. I cooked dinner that night, nothing fancy, just roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans. It was a meal David had loved since he was a boy. We sat at the table, passing dishes around, and I tried to ask Emily questions. Where had she grown up? What was her family like? What were her dreams? She answered politely, speaking of Connecticut summers, private schools, her love for design, her family's real estate business. Every answer felt rehearsed, as though she had said it 100 times before at 100 different dinner tables. David laughed easily with her, his eyes rarely leaving her face. He looked so alive, so invested that I bit my tongue when I wanted to press harder, to ask her something real, something beyond surface-level pleasantries. When the meal ended, Emily helped clear the plates, moving with practiced grace in the kitchen. But even then, she seemed like a guest passing through rather than someone who intended to belong. It wasn't until after they left that night, after David hugged me goodbye and said, "See you soon, Dad," that I realized I had barely spoken to him at all. The evening had revolved around Emily, her stories, her laughter, her presence. And while I was glad he was happy, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just been given a glimpse into a future where my role was shrinking. The second time I saw her was during the holidays. David had insisted on bringing her to our small family gathering. I had decorated the house with lights, strung tinsel across the windows, and even dragged the old box of ornaments from the attic. Many of them were handmade by David when he was a child, crooked stars cut from construction paper, a misshapen clay Santa he had made in second grade. They were treasures to me, symbols of a life lived in small but meaningful ways. Emily admired the tree when she arrived, but I noticed the way her eyes lingered on the handmade ornaments, her smile tight. Later that evening, as she sipped wine with David on the couch, I heard her whisper, "These decorations are quaint." She probably didn't mean harm, but the word stung. Quaint. As if the years of memories, of late nights crafting ornaments with my son, were nothing more than outdated trinkets. Still, I let it go. What mattered was David's happiness. If Emily made him laugh, if she gave him the love he deserved, then I could swallow my pride. But it wasn't just her words, it was the way she shaped David over time. He began adopting her mannerisms, her phrases. He started dressing sharper, speaking with a kind of polish that wasn't his before. I could tell he admired her world, her sophistication, and I couldn't blame him. But in the process, he seemed to drift further from mine. I'll never forget one night a year or so later, when David invited me to dinner with her family. They lived in a sprawling home outside the city, the kind with marble counters, grand staircases, and art on the walls that probably cost more than my entire house. I arrived in my best suit, but even then, I felt out of place. Her parents were courteous but cool, their questions always circling back to careers, investments, vacations. When I told them I worked as a supervisor at the plant, they nodded politely, their smiles tight, before shifting the conversation towards stocks and properties. I sat quietly, sipping my water, while David laughed and chatted easily with them, glowing under their approval. Emily's father slapped him on the back, praising his plans for graduate school, while I sat invisible at the end of the table. That night, driving home alone, I realized I was losing him, not because of Emily directly, but because of the world she represented. She offered him a life I never could, a life of ease and privilege, and he was stepping into it willingly. And though I wanted to be proud, I also felt left behind. The real cracks showed when wedding plans began. At first, David assured me I'd be involved. "Don't worry, Dad," he said. "You'll be part of it all." But as months passed, I noticed the pattern. Emily made most of the decisions with her family. The venue, the guest list, the catering, it was all handled without my input. When I asked about it, David shrugged. "Emily's got it under control. You know I'm not great with details." There were subtle exclusions, too. At the rehearsal dinner, I was given a seat at the far end of the table, while Emily's parents sat beside the couple. When speeches were discussed, Emily suggested maybe I shouldn't give one. "Just to keep things simple," she said, her tone light but firm. I wanted to argue, but David nodded, and I swallowed the lump in my throat. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself the day was about them, not me. But deep down, I felt myself being erased. One evening, a few weeks before the wedding, David stopped by the house. We sat in the living room, the TV flickering quietly in the background. I tried to talk to him about the ceremony, about how proud I was, about how much it meant to me. But he seemed distracted, checking his phone, glancing at the clock. Finally, I asked him, "Do you want me there, David? At the wedding?" His head snapped up, eyes wide. "Of course I do, Dad. Why would you even ask that?" "Because sometimes it feels like I'm just an afterthought," I admitted. He sighed, rubbing his face. "It's not like that. Emily just wants everything perfect. You know how she is. Don't take it personally." But how else could I take it? That conversation replayed in my mind the day I stood at the church steps and Emily told me to leave. When she said David agreed, when she insisted he didn't want me there, I remembered his silence, his constant deference to her, his refusal to challenge her even when I was excluded. Maybe he hadn't said the words himself, but in his silence, he had spoken volumes. And that's what hurt the most. Not just her rejection, but his compliance. The boy who once looked for me in the bleachers, who once ran into my arms with scraped knees, had chosen a life where I no longer fit. If you've never felt the slow erosion of a bond you thought unbreakable, I hope you never do. It's not loud, not dramatic. It's quiet, like water dripping on stone. You don't notice at first. You tell yourself the stone is strong, that it will endure. But years later, you look down and realize the surface has worn away, and the shape is unrecognizable. That was me and David. That was what Emily's presence had done, not out of malice, perhaps, but out of inevitability. And yet, even knowing all of this, even sensing the cracks, I still believed the wedding day would be different. I still believed he would stand up for me, that he would want me there, that he would recognize everything I had given, everything I had sacrificed. But belief is not the same as truth. And the truth revealed itself at the church doors, when Emily spoke and David remained silent. The weeks leading up to the wedding were supposed to be filled with excitement. At least, that's what I told myself. I imagined helping David pick out his tuxedo, standing beside him at the rehearsal dinner, maybe even practicing a father of the groom speech in the mirror late at night. I thought about all the small moments we'd share, tightening his tie before the ceremony, clapping him on the shoulder, reminding him that marriage was about partnership, about weathering storms together. That was the dream. But the reality was far different. From the very beginning, I felt the distance. The announcements came through group texts I was barely included in. A message would appear, "We've decided on the venue," or "Cake tasting tomorrow," and I'd realize no one had asked if I wanted to come. Emily's parents, the Johnsons, seemed to have their fingerprints on every detail. They had money, connections, and an eagerness to put their stamp on the occasion. I was just a man on the sidelines, the father who had worked his fingers raw but didn't have a checkbook that opened doors. One Saturday, David called me, not to ask for advice, but to let me know decisions had already been made. "We booked the venue, Dad," he said, his voice buzzing with excitement. "It's at the Willow Estate. You'll love it, it's beautiful." I had never heard of the place. Later, I looked it up online. Sprawling gardens, chandeliers in every hall, ceilings that soared like cathedrals. It was gorgeous, but it also screamed money. The kind of place where people like me didn't usually belong. "Sounds nice," I said, forcing cheer into my voice. "When do we go see it?" There was a pause. We've already toured it. Emily's parents set it up." I swallowed hard. "I see." That became the pattern. Dresses chosen without my input, menus sampled at restaurants I wasn't invited to, photographers hired without me even knowing their names. I wanted to believe it wasn't intentional, that it was just a whirlwind of planning. But each time I was excluded, it felt like another small cut, another reminder that I wasn't truly part of this chapter in my son's life. The rehearsal dinner should have been my moment to shine, to welcome everyone, to show pride in my son. But when I arrived, I found myself seated at the far end of the long table, away from David and Emily, away from the Johnsons. Emily's father sat right beside the couple, raising glasses, telling stories, laughing loudly. I listened, smiled politely, and tried to join in, but the conversation seemed to flow around me like water skirting a rock in a river. I was present, but not included. When it came time for speeches, I stood to speak, my heart pounding. I had rehearsed a few words about David, about his strength, his kindness, about the joy of watching him grow. But before I could even clear my throat, Emily touched David's arm and whispered something. He nodded and then glanced at me with an apologetic look. "Dad," he said softly, "let's keep the speeches short tonight. Just the best man." I sat back down slowly, my cheeks burning, my throat tight. Around me, the laughter carried on. No one noticed the man at the end of the table, the father whose words had just been silenced. At one point during the preparations, I offered to help pay for something, anything. I suggested covering the flowers, or maybe the music. David gave me a small smile and said, "It's okay, Dad. Emily's parents have it all covered. Don't worry about it." But I did worry. I worried because it wasn't about the money. It was about being part of the story. About having a role in the most important day of my son's life. I wanted to contribute, not because I needed credit, but because that's what fathers do. We show up, we give what we can, we leave a mark. And yet here I was, being quietly pushed into the shadows. There were smaller moments too, moments that seemed insignificant to others but cut deep for me. At the tuxedo fitting, I stood off to the side while David tried on suits. Emily fussed over his lapels, smoothed his tie, adjusted his cuffs. The tailor asked if I wanted to be fitted for a matching suit, but Emily answered for me. "No, he'll just wear his own. We want the pictures to be cohesive." I smiled politely, but inside I felt the sting. My son, the groom, and his new family would be a picture-perfect set. I would be the odd man out. Another time, during a casual gathering at their apartment, the topic of the wedding video came up. Emily laughed and said, "We'll have the videographer start with David walking down the aisle with my dad. It'll be such a beautiful moment." I froze. "With your dad?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Emily looked at me, still smiling, as though it were obvious. "Well, yes. He's been so involved, and it just makes sense." David shifted uncomfortably, glanced at me, and then back at her. He didn't correct her. He didn't speak up. He just let the moment pass. I felt my stomach twist, my hands trembling slightly as I set down the glass I was holding. I wanted to say something, to remind them that I was David's father, that I had raised him, sacrificed for him, loved him more than my own breath. But the words caught in my throat. To protest would sound bitter, defensive, and I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing me small. So I kept quiet, swallowing another hurt. The closer the day came, the more invisible I became. Invitations were sent without my knowledge. My relatives received theirs before I even knew they had gone out. When I asked about my role in the ceremony, Emily brushed it off. "We'll figure something out," she said. But nothing was ever figured out. No place was carved out for me, no acknowledgement made. And yet, despite all of it, I kept telling myself it would be different on the day itself. I pictured walking up those church steps, being greeted by David with open arms, being pulled into pictures, being told, "I couldn't have done this without you, Dad." I clung to that vision like a drowning man clings to driftwood. I see now that hope blinded me. It kept me from seeing the truth that was already unfolding, piece by piece. By the time I arrived at the church that morning, the writing had already been on the wall. I had been slowly erased from the narrative long before the doors closed in my face. And yet, no matter how many signs I ignored, nothing could have prepared me for the sting of hearing Emily say it aloud. "You're not welcome. Please leave." Because there's a difference between being sidelined and being shut out completely. There's a difference between feeling invisible and being told you don't belong. And that difference is the line that was crossed at my son's wedding. The morning of the wedding was cool, the kind of crisp air that makes you breathe deeper, as though you can taste the season changing. I woke before dawn, my heart restless, my body already humming with nerves. I told myself it was excitement. I told myself this was the day everything would shift for the better. Today would be my son's wedding, and no matter what had happened in the past, no matter the tensions or exclusions, I would be there. I would stand as a father should, steady, proud, unshakable. I took extra care getting ready. I shaved slowly, making sure the blade left no shadow behind. I pressed my shirt again even though I'd ironed it the night before. I polished my shoes until I could almost see my reflection. The navy blue suit, the one I had worn only for the most important days of David's life, hung crisp and ready. I slipped it on, buttoned the jacket, and stared into the mirror. My hair was gray, my face lined, but my eyes held something steady, hope. On the nightstand sat the small box with the silver ribbon. Inside was my father's pocket watch, the heirloom I had been saving for this day. I picked it up carefully, ran my thumb along the engraving, and whispered, "This is for you, son." My plan was to hand it to him before the ceremony began, a final gift before he took his vows, a symbol of continuity, of love passed from one generation to the next. The drive to the church felt surreal. The streets were nearly empty, as though the whole world was holding its breath. I kept replaying memories in my mind, David's first steps, his first day of school, his high school graduation. Each one felt like a stepping stone to this day. My chest swelled with pride at the thought of how far he'd come. When I pulled into the parking lot, cars were already lined up neatly, guests filing into the church in their polished shoes and tailored dresses. Their laughter floated in the air, light and joyful. I stepped out of my car, the watch box in hand, and straightened my tie. My pulse thudded with both nerves and anticipation. This was it. The moment I had been waiting for. I climbed the steps slowly, each one carrying the weight of years. I imagined David inside, adjusting his tie, pacing nervously as grooms do. I imagined him smiling when he saw me, maybe pulling me into a hug, whispering, "I'm glad you're here, Dad." I pictured us standing together for photos, side by side, a father and son bound by love and history. But none of that happened. The heavy wooden doors of the church opened just as I reached the top step. And there she was, Emily, in her wedding gown, already dressed, already radiant, her veil catching the morning light. For a heartbeat, I thought she had come to greet me, to welcome me in. But then I saw her eyes. Cold. Sharp. Unforgiving. "Robert," she said, her voice low but firm. "You can't come in." I blinked, certain I had misheard. "What?" "You're not welcome here," she repeated. "David agrees. Please leave before this becomes a scene." The words struck like a physical blow. My grip tightened around the watch box until the ribbon dug into my skin. "What are you talking about? I'm his father. This is my son's wedding." Her expression didn't waver. "This day is about David and me. It's not about you. You've already caused too much tension. If you really care about him, you'll leave." Quietly. My mouth went dry, my chest hollow. "He knows I'm here. He invited me." Emily shook her head, her veil brushing against her cheek. "He doesn't want a scene. He agrees this is best." Behind her, the glow of candles flickered in the dim church. I could hear faint music, the organ warming up, the shuffle of guests finding their seats. The life I had been building toward, the moment I turned away, the church doors closing behind me with a soft thud that felt louder than thunder. Back at my car, I sat in the driver's seat, staring at the watch box on the passenger side. My vision blurred. The world outside moved on, the chatter of guests, the music swelling inside the church, but I sat hollow, erased from my own son's story. I waited for a call, for a text, for any sign that David knew, that he cared, that he would come to the doors and pull me in. None came. Minutes passed. Then an hour. By then, the ceremony had begun, the vows spoken, the rings exchanged. My son became a husband while I sat in the parking lot, clutching an heirloom that would never reach his hands. The humiliation was unbearable, but beneath it was something worse: silence. David's silence. The boy who once ran to me with scraped knees, the young man I had sacrificed everything for, had not spoken up, had not intervened, had not even stepped outside to see me. That silence screamed louder than any words Emily could have thrown at me. When I finally turned the key in the ignition, the sound of the engine roared in my ears, almost drowning out the ache inside me. I drove away slowly, the church growing smaller in the rearview mirror, until it was just a blur. My hands gripped the wheel, my knuckles white, but I barely noticed the road. My mind replayed the scene again and again: Emily's cold eyes, her firm voice, David's absence. I don't remember much of the drive home. Just the heaviness in my chest, the weight of the watch box still on the seat beside me. When I walked into my empty house, the silence was crushing. I set the box down on the table, sat in my chair, and stared at the walls until the daylight faded. That night I didn't sleep. I lay awake, my mind circling endlessly around the same questions. Why hadn't David defended me? Had I failed him so deeply that he believed I didn't deserve to be there? Was I really nothing more than an embarrassment, a relic of a life he wanted to leave behind? The humiliation of being turned away was sharp, but the deeper wound was knowing my son had allowed it. That he had stood by silent, as I was erased from his most important day. That silence was the true betrayal, and it echoed in my ears long after the music of his wedding had ended. The days after the wedding were the longest of my life. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, each hour dragging on with the weight of silence. I woke in the mornings expecting to hear the phone ring, expecting to see David's name flash across the screen. I told myself he would call, that he would explain, that he would say it wasn't what I thought. But the phone stayed still, the screen dark, and my house echoed with the kind of emptiness that makes your own footsteps sound foreign. The watch box still sat on the dining table, unopened, untouched. Each time I passed it, I felt a pang in my chest. I had imagined the moment of handing it over, of watching David's face soften with recognition, of hearing him say he would treasure it. Instead, it remained a gift undelivered, a symbol of everything I had wanted to give but never could. Some nights, I would sit in the dim light of the kitchen and hold it in my hands, running my thumb over the ribbon until it frayed. Word of what happened traveled faster than I expected. In towns like ours, gossip has wings. Neighbors who had seen me at the church parking lot whispered their versions of the story. Some were sympathetic, soft looks at the grocery store, murmured words like, "I'm sorry, Robert. That must have been hard." Others were more curious than kind, tilting their heads as if I were some strange creature to be studied. A few avoided me altogether, as though my humiliation might be contagious. The worst part was not the whispers but the pity. Pity is a sharp blade dressed as kindness. It slices deeper than outright cruelty because it reminds you of your powerlessness. I didn't want their pity. I wanted my son. I tried reaching out to him. The night after the wedding, I called. The phone rang and rang, then went to voicemail. My voice trembled as I left a message. "David, it's Dad. I don't know what happened, son. I don't understand. But I love you. I need to see you. Please call me." I waited by the phone all night. It never rang. The next day, I tried again. And the day after. Each time, the calls went unanswered. I sent messages, simple ones at first. "Can we talk? I just want to see you." Later, longer ones, pouring out everything I couldn't hold inside. "I raised you the best I knew how. I made mistakes, I know I did. But I was there, son. I was always there. Please don't shut me out." Weeks passed with no reply. I replayed our life together in my head, searching for the moment I had lost him. Was it when I worked too many hours and missed one of his games? Was it when I pushed him too hard in school? Was it when I failed to say the words he needed most, that I was proud, that he was enough, just as he was? Every memory became a trial, every choice a potential crime for which I now face punishment. I thought about Linda, about how she would have handled things if she were still here. She had always been softer, more patient. She would have known the right words, the right tone. She would have bridged the gap between us with ease. Sometimes I wondered if David resented me for her absence, if he blamed me silently for not being able to fill the void she left behind. It was a weight I carried alone, the guilt of being only half the parent he needed. People told me to move on, to accept that David had made his choice. "Kids grow up," one friend said. "They live their own lives." But this wasn't just about growing up. This was about being erased. About being told, in no uncertain terms, that I was no longer wanted in the family I had built with my own hands. The loneliness became suffocating. I stopped going to church because I couldn't bear the stares. I stopped attending neighborhood barbecues because every cheerful laugh felt like a reminder of what I had lost. Even at work, I kept to myself, ignoring the sympathetic looks from coworkers who had heard the whispers. I moved through the days like a ghost, present in body but absent in spirit. One evening, I drove past David's house. The lights were on, silhouettes moving inside, laughter spilling faintly through the open windows. For a moment, I imagined knocking on the door, imagined him opening it, his face lighting up as he pulled me in. But then I remembered the look in Emily's eyes at the church, the firmness of her voice, the way David had stayed silent. My hand froze on the steering wheel. I kept driving. The hardest part was the memories that crept in when I least expected them. A song on the radio that we used to sing in the car. The smell of grilled burgers that reminded me of summer cookouts in the backyard. The sight of a father tossing a baseball with his son in the park. Each one struck like a hammer, reminding me of everything that had been and everything that was now gone. I began writing letters to David. Long, handwritten ones on yellow paper. In them, I told him stories of his childhood, moments he might have forgotten. The time he fell asleep on my shoulders at the county fair. The night we stayed up late building a model rocket that barely made it off the ground before tipping over. I reminded him of the laughter, the love, the bond that had once been so strong. I ended every letter the same way: I love you, son. I always will. No matter what. I mailed them one by one, my hope dwindling with each unanswered week. None were returned, but none were acknowledged either. I didn't know if he read them, or if Emily intercepted them, or if they were tossed aside unopened. The uncertainty gnawed at me worse than rejection. At least rejection was an answer. In the stillness of my empty home, I thought about what it meant to be a father. I had always believed it was about providing, about working hard, putting food on the table, keeping a roof overhead. But maybe it was more than that. Maybe it was about presence, about words spoken, about moments shared. Maybe my silence over the years had built walls between us as surely as Emily's disdain had. Yet even knowing my flaws, I couldn't reconcile the outcome. I couldn't accept that decades of love and sacrifice could be erased in one day, in one moment at the doors of a church. It seemed impossible, unthinkable. And yet it had happened. Sometimes I wondered if David was happier without me. If Emily's world had given him everything mine could not, and if cutting me out was simply the price of admission. That thought was a knife, but one I couldn't put down. I don't know how long a man can live with that kind of ache. All I know is that each day after the wedding stretched longer than the one before, and each night ended the same way, me staring at the ceiling, whispering into the dark. I'm still here, son. I'm still your father. And the dark never answered back. Months turned into a year, and the silence between David and me became its own kind of language. At first I fought against it, calls, letters, messages that went unanswered. But after a while I stopped fighting. Not because I had given up on loving him, but because I realized I couldn't force him to return what he wasn't willing to give. That realization nearly broke me. Nearly, but not quite. Life has a way of continuing, even when you think yours has ended. The world doesn't pause for grief. Bills still arrive, neighbors still wave, the seasons still change. I kept going to work, kept mowing the lawn, kept fixing the leaky faucet in the kitchen. On the surface, I was functioning. But underneath, I carried a hollowness I couldn't shake. It was at church one Sunday morning, after months of avoiding the place, that something shifted. A young man named Aaron sat beside me. He couldn't have been more than 20, rough around the edges, his clothes worn, his eyes tired. During the service, he leaned over and asked me if I knew how to fix a carburetor. I laughed, really laughed, for the first time in months. Afterward, I walked with him to the parking lot and spent an hour under the hood of his beat-up car, showing him the basics. That small moment turned into something more. Aaron began stopping by my house, asking questions, sometimes just sitting at the table drinking coffee. He reminded me of David, young, searching, carrying more weight than he should at his age. And in helping him, I found myself healing. I wasn't replacing my son. No one could. But I was reminded of what it felt like to guide, to teach, to care. Fatherhood isn't a role you retire from. It's something that stays in your bones. In time, I began volunteering at a local community center, mentoring kids who didn't have fathers around. Some of them were tough, hardened by circumstances I couldn't fully imagine. Others were quiet, withdrawn, unsure of themselves. Each one reminded me, in some way, of the boy I had raised. I poured into them what I wished I could still pour into David: patience, encouragement, love. And though it didn't erase the pain, it gave the pain a purpose. I still thought of David every day. I wondered if he was happy, if he had children yet, if he ever thought of me. Sometimes, when the ache grew too strong, I pulled out the watch box. It still sat on the table, the ribbon frayed from my restless fingers. I never sent it. Maybe one day I will. Or maybe it will sit here until I'm gone, a reminder of the love I carried but couldn't give. Healing didn't come all at once. It came in small doses, in laughter with strangers, in conversations with neighbors, in the quiet understanding that life doesn't end with loss. It bends, it reshapes, it forces you to find new ways to carry the weight. Some days were easier than others. Some nights, I still lay awake whispering, "I love you, son," into the dark. But I learned to live with the silence that followed. And if there's one thing I've taken from all of this, it's this: family is more than blood. Blood connects us, yes, but it does not guarantee loyalty, kindness, or love. Family is the people who choose you, who stand by you, who see your flaws and stay anyway. Sometimes those people are your children, your parents, your siblings. And sometimes, they're strangers who become something more. I don't know if David will ever come back to me. I don't know if Emily will always stand in the doorway, keeping me out. Maybe one day he'll knock on my door, the watch box still waiting, and say he's ready to bridge the years of silence. Maybe he won't. Either way, I've learned that my worth as a father, as a man, is not determined by who accepts me. It's determined by the love I give, even when it isn't returned. So if you're listening to my story, if you've walked this journey with me from the beginning, I want to leave you with this: don't wait. Don't wait to tell the people you love how much they mean to you. Don't wait to say you're proud, to say you forgive, to say you care. Because one day, you might find the doors closed, and the words unsaid will weigh heavier than any rejection. And if you've been where I've been, if you've felt erased, cast aside, silenced, know this: your love still matters. Even if it isn't received, even if it isn't acknowledged, it matters. Because love is not diminished by rejection. It is diminished only when we stop giving it. I will always love my son. Nothing can erase that. But I have also learned to love beyond him, to pour into others, to find family where I didn't expect it, to keep my heart open even when it's been broken. That, perhaps, is the truest legacy of fatherhood. So if you're a parent, a child, a friend, or simply someone with love in your heart, don't let silence win. Speak the words today. Show the love now. Because tomorrow is never promised, and once the doors close, you may never get the chance again.